Perfect. So thanks for the introduction. So thanks for having me, and I'm very sorry that I cannot join you in Valencia. Yeah, so as you said in the introduction, I'm investigating the role of metaphorical thinking in driving the regulation towards data. As we've seen during the course of the morning, the regulation of the data economy is a top priority for the European Union. And as a matter of fact, since the most recent advancement in the way in which we collect, we store, and we analyze data allowed for the development of machine learning techniques, artificial intelligence systems, and the Internet of Things, among the others, the European Union has enacted new regulations, and there is a rapid movement in the legal framework in order, on one side, to exploit all the opportunities offered by the new technologies, and on the other side, to protect the citizens from new harms. However, data still reside in what Caterina Pistor defined as a legal gray zone. As a matter of fact, from a technical point of view, data can be defined as machine-readable encoded information. Basically, they are a combination of 0 and 1 that carries semantic content. But their economic function is much harder to grasp. They have been defined recurring to metaphors that associate them to most well-known economic concepts. So, for instance, we all heard the metaphor that data are the new oil, which means that they are a commodity. But data has also been defined as a public good and as the infrastructure of the future. So, what we see is that a specificity of the discussion around the regulation of data is that it recurs to metaphorical thinking. It heavily relies on the use of analogies. What is metaphorical thinking? Basically, it's the description of an object in terms of another object. One classical example is homo homini lupus, or man is wolf to man. In this case, humanity is described by making reference to some of the characteristics of wolves, and in this way, some characteristics of humanity are highlighted, while some others are, of course, overlooked. And the way in that this balance of characteristics that are highlighted against characteristics that are overlooked or shadowed, let's say, can be seen very easily in the case of man is wolf to man in Hobbes' political philosophy, for instance. So what we decide to focus on, the characteristics that we choose as defining the subject matter of our analysis, they influence the legislation that we propose, that we deem more apt for the topic. And metaphorical thinking is not new for making reference to new technologies. In fact, it allows for the identification of what is familiar in unfamiliar concepts. So let's think when a malware started circulating at first, it was probably quite hard to explain exactly their functioning, as they were a quite technical object. But then someone had the idea of describing them as viruses, so through an analogy. In this way, the characteristic of viruses, or some of the characteristics of viruses, were associated to malware. And yeah, the PowerPoint is not perfect here because the format was a bit missed, but malware became immediately very easy to understand as damaging and transmittable. So as you can see, not all of the characteristics of viruses and of wolves are associated respectively to malwares and to man, but only what Black refers to as a system of commonplaces, which is basically what, let's say, the man of the street would associate to the object. For instance, if we ask to someone without a specific knowledge, what do you associate to virus? Probably it will be like it's damaging and transmissible. What would you associate to wolf? It's aggressive, it's dangerous. Even if specialists highlight that wolves are highly cooperative, for instance. So in trying to understand how the reliance of metaphors and analogies in describing that data influences the regulation of the data economy, the first step relies on the identification of the system of commonplaces, so the characteristics of respectively commodities, public goods, and infrastructures that are passed and transferred to data. The second step relies in the tracing of these common places in the legislative text. So, of course, not the technical language of legislative text does not rely on analogies. We will never find in a legislation, in a law, the exact words, data is the new oil. But what we can find is those properties, the description of those properties that we can use as indicators that can show how the metaphorical thinking passed from the public discourse to the legislative text. Then I will try to draw some preliminary conclusions. So at first, I will focus on the identification of the system of common places, those characteristics that are associated to data. When we describe data as commodities, we focus on their commercial value, the value that data have on the market. In fact, as oil, data are scarce, they have to be extracted, they have needs to be refined, they are fungible, and they are an essential asset for all the firms operating in downstream markets. It means that data have value not because of their quality, but because they are available in huge quantities. It means that the objective of the legislation, if we conceive data as being commodities, should be to promote transparency and a well-functioning market for data, where data can be exchanged at a fair price. The second analogy associates data as public goods. Scholars focusing on this analogy or conceiving data as public goods argue that data are not exchanged as much. There is not a market for data, and they focus on the use value of data. As a matter of fact, the use that we make of data is very it's different from person to person. Every actor in the economy makes a different use. But the rationale for data sharing is that data are non-excludable and non-rival. That means that they are public goods. Data are non-excludable as the sunshine or the national defense, for instance, because once the data are produced, everyone can use them. And data are non-rival because even if the same data is used by two actors, it does not diminish its value. So actually some scholars conceive data as pure public goods, so being both non-excludable or non-rival. Some scholars conceive data as impure public goods, so being only non-rival but excludable, or only non-excludable but rival. But when excludability and rivalry are used as a framework for the analysis of data, we know that the analogy that is adopted is data as public goods, and that the objective of the legislation is considered to be to solve issues of underproduction or undersupply. In fact, the problem of public goods, as they have been theorized by Samuelson, is that if once the good is produced, everyone can freely use it, who will pay for the production of that good in the first place? So in the case of data, there might be an issue not of underproduction, but of undersupply. No one will be willing to share the data, even if they produce it, but they will want to keep them for themselves. And the legislation should enable the coordination of those collective actions problem, assigning clear control over data. So when a solution or legislation towards data sharing is focusing on assigning ownership rights or intellectual property rights on data, we know that the analogy that is adopted is the one of data as public goods. The last one is data as infrastructure. And here the source of value is the potential value that stems from future application of data, as we don't know exactly which use can be made from the data. The focus is on the multiplicity of innovation trajectories of data. And the objective of the legislation is to promote access to all the actors in the economy, irrespectively of their position on the data value chain, because the same data can produce positive effects owned by anyone. We don't know what is the actual value of data, because potentially in the future this data will produce enormous richness, even if now it seems like not useful. So very quickly, I try to trace those common places in the legislative text with an example. I tried to analyze the Open Banking Directive, which is a directive that established an harmonized framework in the European Union for digital and electronic payments. And I found sign of all of those analogies. So data are considered to be non-rival and the extrudibility is considered to be difficult. Data are considered essential inputs for the provision of downstream services. And mostly data are considered to be infrastructures. It means that with the access to accounts rule, which has been highly debated, third-party providers are allowed to acquire data on consumer transactions. So from this analysis, I can draw some preliminary conclusions. First of all, the metaphorical thinking can pass from the policy debate to the lawmaking process, as the analysis of the first piece of legislation, the Open Banking Directive, showed. But there are some risks that can stem from the overlapping of different analogies that are always left implicit in the legal text. First of all, implementation can be ineffective, and there can be issues arising from a not clear intention of the legislator. So national courts can implement the directive or the regulation in different ways. And then this lack of explicit recognition of what is the analogy at play can lead to increased legal uncertainty, which in the case of the data economy it's damaging because it reduces investments in R&D. Ultimately, it is important to keep on understanding which is the analogy adopted, because the analogy that we move from when drafting the legislation determines a different weighting of risks and opportunities that comes from the development of the data economy. So ultimately it will determine a more pessimistic or a more optimistic approach towards the lawmaking exercises. And so the risks might be weighted more, might be given more importance, or on the other side, the opportunities might be given more importance. And at this regards, I will continue my research in this field. And as you can see, it's a preliminary stage. So every feedback is much welcome by email, as we don't have much time now. But there is my email, and I look forward to hear from you.
Ahora parece sí. Hi, I'm sorry. So we had some connection problems, but we managed to hear all of your presentation. It just stopped working right at the end. So thank you, Sara, for your presentation. We don't have much time, but if are there any questions? Yeah.
A very quick one. So my question would be, because this metaphor, I think it's interesting. In fact, is related with some ideas that some of the panelists have already expressed. But my question would be, how you think it would be possible to implement those ideas, because the test case that you show is not exactly an example, I think, of enforcement of these exact ideas that you were presenting, and I think they are really interesting. But my impression is that the European Union legislation process is not exactly relying on this metaphor and not trying to explore them. What would be your proposal to, in practical terms, try to achieve it?
So What I think is missing in many of the legislation towards data, and especially, for instance, in the DMA at this point, is an evaluation of the effects that on the relationship between firms operating in the sector. So I think the use of analogies can be useful if it's related to the context. So what I propose to do in my PhD research is to find a variable that measures the nature of the relationship within firms, and then to each context, to each contextual variable, associate like the metaphor that is more apt to describe it, and so the kind of legislation that is more apt, because those analogies are already used, but implicitly. So, for instance, when sharing is advanced as a development or only bringing innovation, while the risks are not as much highlighted, we are using a specific metaphors. And when we focus more on the risks and not on the opportunities for innovation that derive from sharing, we use another metaphor. But this is done mostly as a result of lobbying activities, and not putting these solutions in relation to the context of the contextual relationship of firms and their comparative and competitive relations.